The Volume Podcast.
Okay. Hi, my name is Morgan Klaus Scheuerman. I am a PhD student in information science at the University of Colorado Boulder, and I study representational bias in machine learning, particularly computer vision.
So, what do you think it's in you that's specifically yours that drove you to do what you do today and what you study today?
Yeah, that's that's a hard question. Um, it's very hard to pinpoint what about me drove me to this. I think it's such an amalgamation of things. So, like, my own identity as a queer person definitely, contributed interest to exploring identity issues in machine learning. Um, I think that is kind of a major part of it. And then I don't know how to describe it. I guess I just have like I am also a first generation college student, and I never expected to go do research or be a PhD student. And I've worked, a bunch of jobs. I worked so much like service and retail, and I tried to get into other things like marketing and stuff, like what is my career going to be? And I just never have felt as driven or passionate about something as I do doing this kind of research. And so I don't know if that's necessarily like unique to me, but it's, I guess, unique to my life that I found a thing that I really care about. And so it's easy for me to, really dedicate time to that.
That's awesome. So, tell me a little bit about what is that work. So, what you're researching, what you're focusing on.
Yeah, so my research is primarily focused on how social identities like gender and race are represented in computer vision systems, particularly, systems that classify information about people's faces or their bodies, but mostly I focused on faces. And I'm also kind of moving into my thesis, so I'm thinking about how to expand on that work because a lot of my work has looked specifically at the data or the models and how they're representing specific things like gender categories. But I'm also really interested in work practice. So, what are the decisions being made behind the scenes about identity characteristics? And so I'm thinking a lot about how to kind of triangulate around these issues to focus on, every piece of the picture that is happening here. So, what do annotators do? What do they think about, and how are they driving these decisions? And what do product teams discuss when they're creating a product that's in any way related to human identity? And so these are questions that I'm moving into. Um, and then more broadly, I'm really interested in the concept of technological harm and mitigating technological harm. So I've done some work on social media use and experience with, harm as marginalized people. And yeah, so I guess that's kind of like the overarching care that I have about these systems is to make sure that they aren't doing harm. The first study I ever did was interviewing, trans people and people who are non-binary about how they felt about gender classification through AI. And so, I found, to me, it was unsurprising in many ways that people were concerned about this technology. I mean, there were some views that were like, oh, maybe if it was used for good in some way that it would be fine, but most people were concerned about it. And then looking at classification rates, I guess I was surprised to find that. So I did a study comparing the classification rates of trans men, trans women, cis men, and cis women. And I was surprised to find that trans men were classified incorrectly more often. I don't know why. I guess based on kind of societal conversations around trans identity, a lot of people focus on trans women and how what they look like, how they're moving through space, like those kinds of things. And so I was surprised to find that trans men who are regularly not talked about in the discourse around trans identity were misclassified most often. So that was really interesting. Unsurprised that, there are no commercial systems that don't classify just men and women. So another study I did was, where do these categories come from, both gender and race? And even though this was my first systematic analysis of computer vision literature on this, I've also read so much of it through these other projects that I was not super surprised to find that, there's not a lot of justification for the categories that are used. There's not a lot of historical sources or documents that are, driving this. Even with race, you would think that maybe because we're so sensitive to racial issues that people would feel the need to justify which categories they pick, but it's actually, it's not very common in computer vision literature. It's kind of ad hoc. Just pick, you just pick and it seems obvious maybe to the researcher. I think what's really interesting is that in many cases there's like a misalignment because this is an applied field. So there's this idea that there should be some applicable use case, particularly for society. So a lot of even research papers will, motivate, why am I doing this research? Oh, because maybe people will find this useful. A lot of the times it's, maybe police will find this useful. But then there's very little engagement with, what actually happens when the system is made in the way that has been proposed. And so I find this, I feel like a lot of my research kind of, in the end, questions this. Like, why are we not paying more attention to these social implications and not just the technical implications? And in many ways, it's interesting. I think tech companies have thought about this more than researchers. And usually, at least in my field, HCI researchers think in many ways that we are much better than the tech companies, right? We're much more ethical. We're much more thoughtful. But in many ways, just conversations I've had, with people at tech companies who are working on this stuff, I think they're thinking about it much more than the computer science researchers are, in general. Which, yeah, I just find it fascinating. But yeah, they could definitely do better because there's still a lot of problems with how they're approaching these things.
And also regarding the data that they use.
Yeah, I mean, data in general is an issue. It's almost like an insurmountable issue in this space. Like you need data for any kind of machine learning. Assuming, machine learning and algorithms and all of that is where we want to go. People are going to keep developing them, and the idea of abolishment is hard. So assuming that data is kind of a necessity, like all of these systems are built only on data. Without data, they are absolutely useless. And so tech companies, I guess, are hitting so many ethical snags with, if we even want to improve fairness for certain people, we want our systems to work equally on every person. Ideally, you have to get a lot of data of different groups of people. And so there are these ethical considerations of like, what is it like to, a lot of it is scrape data, to basically steal in some ways or misuse people's data in unexpected ways, particularly for marginalized groups. Should we be paying people? Would people consent? How expensive and time consuming is that? Should that be more important than getting equal error rates? So I think data is a really thorny issue in this space.
And how do you think researching this changed your vision of the world?
I guess, that's such a good question. I mean, I feel like it's very subtly changed my perception of technology over time. I mean, I don't have a computer science background, so that might be a thing. So, I didn't have any kind of intricate knowledge of, or even really pay, I guess, like the general public, right? Like sometimes it's easy to forget that people make these systems. And so, that is so ingrained to me now, but maybe it wasn't ingrained to me some time ago, over 5 years ago or whatever, when I started doing this. So I definitely think my perspective has shifted to focus more on people as, laborers or creators or whatever you want to think of them as, who are shaping these systems. And, these systems are not inevitable either. So that's definitely, always on my mind. I think sometimes I feel like I can become too distant from the general public as an academic and a researcher, and that's easy for us to do. We can so easily think, oh, everyone wants to ban facial recognition from police use, but I don't know if that's actually true. So I'm just kind of reflecting on, like, was I that person? Was I a representative of the general public before? And now my view has shifted so much to be rather critical of these systems because they're very, their implications are so large, and they're made by fallible people. So I think I actually have become more critical of systems, but also in some ways more hopeful. It's like a very weird contrast, I think. Like I guess I feel a little bit cynical, like more cynical than I would have, before I knew anything about them. Um, that we can correct some of the issues that, or even that the issues are correctable. So like issues of facial recognition might not even be correctable. Like there's so many varying viewpoints, that it should be totally banned, that it should meet a certain threshold of accuracy, and these are very differing perspectives. And so, but also I guess I feel hopeful because I also know that there are so many people working to make this area better. So it's like a tension for me, but that was a really long-winded way to say that I'm just much more attuned, I think, to everything that's happening.
How do you think this, we talked a little bit about this already, but how do you think this impact the life of whoever is listening to the podcast right now?
I guess I can imagine, maybe someone will become super interested in this space. I think maybe I can talk more about what I hope could happen than what I think will happen when people are listening. Um, but my hope would be like, I just like in the piece with Deb Raji, I just really want more diverse perspectives to enter this space, and I think that's super valuable. I don't think that we should have, only computer scientists in this space, and this is something that for me was a huge imposter syndrome, right? Like I didn't feel like, this is a place for me because I'm not a computer scientist in training, by training. And so my hope is that, any person who thinks their perspective is relevant would, maybe start becoming involved or becoming parts of working groups in this space, or, it doesn't have to be research. It could be design, it could be marketing, it could be PR, it could be reporting, anything that could get people motivated that aren't traditionally, attuned to things like computer vision or machine learning. I just would like to see that happen. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of diversity, right? I mean, if we don't, we've been asking for that in companies, but if we don't have that at research labs and areas, we won't have that vision also. So yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's still like super true too. What I know of what researchers are represented in this space in companies, and generally companies hire machine learning researchers to do any kind of machine learning research. It is very rare to have non-machine learning, non-computer scientists, PhDs involved in research at large tech companies. If they are, they're usually called user experience researchers, and they're very product focused. They're not very, what research science questions can we be asking to expand the worldview? So I I was an intern at Google's ethical AI team, and I was I think the only intern in that summer program last year that was a research science intern, not a UX intern, who was not a computer scientist. Um, which was also like very isolating. So there's a level of, um, even maintaining that, like if we want to build out, social science research in these companies, you need more than just throwing us into throwing us into the ring, because it is very isolating to be the only person who does, human centered methods or qualitative methods at a company. On machine learning. So I think this is another part of the issue is like, we should be hiring people who are trained in anthropology and political science and social science and the humanities to also be doing research for these companies. Um, yeah, sorry, that was my little soapbox moment.
No, no reason to be sorry. So now it's my last question, and I think it's also not an easy one. So, how do you see your work and your field of work in 10 years?
These are all extremely hard questions. I just feel like it's so hard to predict where something like machine learning can go, because it also has changed so much in the past like 5 years, right? Especially like looking at it historically, you can see, I mean, it's not a very old field at all. No, I think with computer vision, at least the 1960s was like, this is when it started or whatever. But, there was a huge influx, and we're kind of seeing that now. And then there was the AI winter or whatever. And some people think that maybe that's what we'll hit in the next 10 years is, is there going to be another AI winter because we're going to hit, what we can do technically in terms of progress, and that's kind of what drives the field, like what is the technological limits that we can reach, and maybe we'll reach those until we have better hardware. um, so that's possible, but I also think that because machine learning has become super super ingrained in our everyday life, um, that it won't happen that way. That's my prediction, because there will still be human-centered needs to be met. People will still be making even the most mundane systems, for companies or to sell. And so I think that there will still be a great need, even if the technical progress isn't being made in the direct fields, like the domains of machine learning, there will still be need for like, experience-based research or research in equity or research into how government is using these technologies. So I'm thinking, I guess my prediction is that within the next 10 years we'll hit, technical limits of hardware. So what we can do with, software and innovating machine learning might hit a plateau, but there will be more focus on experience and how humans are interacting with these systems. And I think even the growth of HCI as a field kind of shows that, this is important to companies and the public. And so I think that will be a major focus still in the next 10 years. And maybe it will overtake the technical focus a little bit.
And how do you see, this is one of those like, it's your like TV show moment, but how do you see your life in 10 years? Like, what do you think your work's going to be like?
I guess I have like ideals. So I think like ideally I would love to move into higher level spaces that are focused on working on these systems or doing research on the more meta level. I don't know, like I really admire, institutes like AI Now and things like that. So I'm wondering if that could be me in 10 years. Could I maybe be more of a research mentor or someone who's overseeing these kind of larger scale activist based institutions or whatever? So I think that's more of an ideal than like a prediction for me.
That's awesome. Maybe I should change that question. Make it more into like what do you imagine for 10 years, and how do you see your life in 10 years? Because I wouldn't like to answer that question that way. I would be like,
Yeah, it's, I mean, I also could have never predicted my life within the last 5 to 10 years, so it's like very hard to imagine that it'll be. I've never had a much of a path, some people are like, oh, I've planned out my life or whatever, but I've never done that, so.
oh yeah, I can totally relate to that. So Morgan, thank you so much. It was awesome to talk to you. It was amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. These were some of the most interesting questions that I've answered on some of the podcasts I've been on, so it was really fun to think about.
Awesome. Thank you.
So, we love it. The Volume Podcast.
Hi, if you enjoyed this episode and would like to get in touch with us, maybe make a suggestion or ask a question, please find us on Twitter @Volume Podcast. Thank you.